Hello, Mr. Shen. I think that we can start.
Hello?
Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the second chapter of our Agora Talk Learning from China. Series of lectures that try to bring the Chinese architecture debate closer to us. So last time we talked about Chineseness in contemporary Chinese architecture, and today we'll talk about uncertain by design. So let me present our today's guest, James Shen from People's Architecture Office. So welcome, Mr. Shen.
Thank
It's a
you. Thank you
pleasure.
so much for being here and inviting me.
It's a pleasure. So I think that we can start. So you can start to share your screen.
Okay,
Okay.
does that
Yes, when
you
you are
look good?
ready. Yes, it's fine.
Great. So yes, my office, our name is called People's Architecture Office. We were founded in 2010, and I started this with two partners, Zhang Feng and He Zhe. So there's three of us, and Zhang Feng and He Zhe are from China. They were born and raised there. I'm originally from the U.S. I am ethnically Chinese, but I was born and raised in the U.S. Um, and I had practiced in China for about together with the office for a little over 10 years, and then more recently I decided to move back to the U.S. and start an office in Boston. But I'll be showing mostly work from China. And the theme for the talk is uncertain by design. I think this last year or so now, I think COVID has really made a lot of us much more aware of the uncertainty of things. And it's given us a chance to sort of reflect a little bit on our practice and practicing in China, and how the environment of China is actually really quite. I think the sense of uncertainty in practicing in China and just the general way of life there is quite high. And in fact, I think that's actually um, what we've learned quite a lot from observing this and working with it and incorporating some of these ideas in our design. So I'm going to start with just an introduction of our office, where we're located, the environment around us. Our office is here, this red dot here, and you can see that if anyone's ever been to Beijing, this is Tiananmen Square, this is the Forbidden City up here in the north, and we're very close to really the center of the city and even the center of China. And you can also see in this neighborhood that we're in, it's a very kind of tight knit um, historic neighborhood that's still quite lively and active. So here's a video of our office. We're in one of these old courtyard houses in this area that people call these hutong neighborhoods. Hutongs are these narrow alleyways that are in the older areas of the city. So it's very much of a human scale, you know. And I think people in all of you in Italy are probably would be familiar with these kind of areas in a city. So we renovated this old courtyard house. But it's also a place where we're very much hands-on and very active. We have a little shop, and we do a lot of things in the courtyard area of our office. And these courtyards are what make these houses unique. These are called Siheyuans, courtyard houses in China. And yeah, they're the kind of prototypical type of housing that you would find in Beijing. And you also see that our approach to working is to take things and experiment, and we'll borrow things from neighbors, and try things out, take them for, take some of these ideas out for a spin in the neighborhood. And and yeah, so we're pretty much, we're very closely in touch with the environment around us, and also the community around us. We have events in our office, invite people to come in and to get to know us. And a lot of our work has actually happened, have come out of these interactions with the people around us. So that's quite important for us. So I'll begin with a series of projects where we're really trying to activate space, bring people and more energy into certain locations. And a lot of times these projects are also not permanent, right? So the idea is that we're learning from how people use space from around us, and the space in China it can be very very diverse. All kinds of things are happening. For example, here you have a parking lot, and this ring around this this area. I have no idea what it's for. Maybe there was a tree there at one time, but you see people, they will occupy any kind of space to make use of it. And you see here, I think it works out well for this family, for kids to kind of play around in the space, to feel a little bit secure, having a little bit of seating for people. So learning from these kind of situations, we try to incorporate some of these things into our project. So this was this is an art installation. It's actually a permanent piece. But we're creating space for activity, and you see that we have this ring here that came directly from the image that I just showed you. And these images, we just find them, just things that we notice as we're walking around. Quite fascinated by how people adapt to spaces around them. This was called the Social Network Factory in a city called Shenzhen. This museum is called Design Society, and this was done for the museum. Yeah, and it's made out of these tubes. The functionality of it is unclear, and so it's meant for people to come and experience and to explore. Some of these are periscopes that allow you to see further away, and others, this is a large magnifying glass. It's not, it's not exactly a playground. There are no slides or anything like that. So it's meant to be open-ended for people to discover different ways of using things, just like the example that I showed from the city. And interestingly, this was after, not long after COVID, so they really clamped down quickly. It was never so serious here in the south of China, so that was really great to see that people were still able to take advantage of a lot of the public space and also the space around our project. And also, I think during COVID, you see many parts of the world how people really rely on public space, how important it is for us to go outside and to retain some social interaction. This was here in Boston, a street that was taken over by one of these canopies for outdoor dining. And the little street was closed off. And in China, this happens all the time, how people sort of take over sidewalks and streets and parking lots. And this canopy is a kind of a canopy that allows you to do this temporarily and in sort of an informal way. And you can think of this as also adapting to certain periods of use over time, right? So a lot of times, actually, this happens at night. When things are closed, there's less traffic, and people will then take over parking lots and sidewalks, oftentimes not really with permission. So this is a sort of an informal activity that is still kind of accepted, I guess, by the authorities, although not really official. But these areas, when this happens, it becomes quite lively, right? So we also believe that this is a pretty important part of public life. for one of our projects, we were invited to do something in a city in the UK called Preston, and they wanted us to do a public installation that would connect different parts of the city. And so what we did was we took these campings, we put cycling wheels on them, and made it so that it could be cycled from one place to another. And then when you get to your destination, you can expand these out, and then it's a place for events. And so the procession is kind of a parade type of event, because you're going through the city and you get a lot of attention. People are really interested, and these are all volunteers, people who are interested in participating. And these projects were done always with local government. So this is the second time that we did this. This was actually in Belgium, a city called Leuven. And we just continue to do these projects in lots of different cities. Now we've done this in many cities in different places, different countries, and different situations. But this kind of design it does allow for a good amount of flexibility and customization. So because this comes in many pieces, you can decide how many of these you want, depending on how large of an event you want. They can be all gathered in one location for a large event like this, or they can be separated out into other locations for lots of other smaller events. And also the organization of them just depends on the people that are involved, right? So it is open to a lot of adjustment and interpretation, and is highly reliant on participation. And these are just some of the different cities that we've done this in the different contexts. Another thing that we do is in observing the city, we really try to read into what's going on, how people have adapted space. So when I talk about uncertainty, really, you also have to think of buildings as buildings that will last for quite some time, and the uses for these buildings will change. And certainly in China, you will see a lot of buildings with these HVAC tubes all over the place, right? They're kind of added onto the exterior buildings because you're adding, restaurants and other different uses in places that weren't designed to hold these kinds of uses, right? In basements or rooftops and things like that. Again, a kind of a informal activity. You also, in another way, we also see a lot of people moving furniture out into the streets. The streets become an important public space because there isn't much open space in a lot of cities. This is actually in our own neighborhood. And people will just move indoor furniture out to the streets, and they just sit out there and hang out and watch the city life. So we took these different observations and incorporated them into this project. This is called the Baitasi, tubular Baitasi. Baitasi is the name of this area. It's also a historic area. And they were interested in having this kind of visitor center to invite people to get to know this place. And this area was going through a kind of a regeneration. They wanted to upgrade this area. So there's this old building that they wanted to kind of renovate in a very quick way. I mean, this whole thing took about just a month from the beginning to the end, from the beginning of conceptualizing this to building it. And there's a large interior component, but the part I would focus on is these tubes on the outside. So we just took something that you could just buy off the street, and they're modular, and you can piece these things together. But one thing that probably a lot of you may not get is that this spells out the name of the city. Baitasi, these three words are spelled out in these tubes. So it becomes this very large sign for this area. But also these tubes have different functions that, you know, it can act as urban furniture, just like what we saw in the previous picture. And also a lot of these tubes are, again, periscopes that allow you to look at different significant sites around this neighborhood. So they're pointing at important buildings and places that people may not, you know, new visitors may not be familiar with. And so in this way, we're connecting this site to the rest of the community. And the nice thing is that we don't put up signs, or we don't tell people that you're supposed to sit on this or look through this. And we're very pleased when people just naturally find these uses, and hopefully they find other uses. Another example of architecture that is really embracing the temporary is this project in the city called Tianhai. And this was built for events. Obviously, it's this is all scaffolding, but this was a large outdoor cinema. Had all kinds of different activities and exhibitions in here, and it was done again very quickly. We had these inflatable this inflatable art piece installed above, and people can also walk in the upper levels of this structure. And this kind of a large temporary event space. And another project where we actually try to incorporate lots of different projects into one is this called the People Station. And you can see that this project is actually on a parking lot here, right? You can see the markings. But it's actually now a permanent building. And so the interesting thing is a lot of these projects, they start off maybe with, you know, a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether or not you can even do this project, or is it going to be temporary, or will it be permanent? The thing is, a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do with these spaces. And this is another project where it's a historic area that they're trying to regenerate and bring in more activity. And so this proposal sort of started off small and then kind of ended up into a larger sort of cultural center. And it was built in a way that could be disassembled and relocated if necessary, but was also of a quality of a permanent building. And after it was built, that's when the authorities kind of came in to evaluate whether or not this is okay. You know, so things can really shift and change to this extent. But in any case, this building was built out of prefabricated modular parts. We also had these mobile units. These are tricycles that were spaces that can be moved out, and you could take content from this location out into other areas, right? So part of this was to see how you can reach a larger, a wider audience, not always expecting people to come here, but then for you to actually be able to reach outwards. Inside this building is an exhibition space. There's a small bookshop and a little theater space. And yeah, you can see these tricycles. They incorporated the canopies that you saw previously, and it allows the tricycles to connect to each other or to expand out wherever they stop. We've also done quite a few projects with tricycles, being inspired by a lot of the informality that you find with tricycles. A lot of people sort of doing their business on tricycles, selling things, moving things around, quite common, but seen as an object that is used mostly by a lower income society, a lower income portion of society. So we wanted to bring this to, we wanted to bring this to a larger audience to accept this as something that is quite valuable and unique and an important part of city life. So we've used tricycles quite a lot. We incorporated our people's canopy into this project as well, so that we could have this space that can expand out from the building, and this is part of the exhibition space. The first exhibition was actually a retrospective of our work, so that's why you also see we have some of our tubes that we've used before. These are shipping pallets that have been used to build structures that we've used that for some exhibitions. Yes, and also this canopy can detach, and then people are able to cycle it to other locations and again have events elsewhere. The next section, I'll be talking about memory, history, a sense of place, which I think oftentimes is it can be very uncertain as well, and how we try to. I'll talk a little bit about how we try to deal with this insecurity of place and even of our history. So these plugins, these projects that I'll be showing are called our plugin projects. This one is part of our Quartered House plugin series. And these were done in the neighborhood that our office is in, for the same as what you saw in the video. And this neighborhood is a place where it's actually the conditions are quite poor. Buildings are very, very old, hundreds of years old, run down. And there hasn't been really a great way of being able to upgrade this location. So the city actually had an open call out for ideas. How to upgrade this place, because there are also areas next to us where they did sort of tear everything down, move everyone away, redid the infrastructure, rebuilt everything. But a lot of these projects actually didn't turn out to be very successful, even from an economic point of view. There's an area next to us that they turned a residential area, they turned into a commercial area. They have Starbucks and Zara to kind of build up the economy, but it hasn't been successful. They're not able to rent out a lot of these places. It's a huge project. So after all that effort to rebuild and all that, they were still not very successful. So in this area, they actually were interested in seeing what could happen if you were to, what they're interested in alternatives. What else could you do? So what we suggested was to not change anything, to keep everything as it is, and to build a house in a house. So a new structure inside the original structure, to not touch the old structure at all. So these interior units you see here are the interventions that we came up with. And I think right now during COVID, you see this quite a lot, right? You'll see buildings being used, being designed for one use and then converted to other uses, and buildings being built inside other buildings to adapt to the situation, right? Situations that we just didn't expect. And also in China, you also see this quite a lot. So this is actually a very old bank building in that same area. And you can see people here have built spaces inside this large space. So actually now this bank building has been turned into housing. Many families live here in several stories. And they've just kind of built in all these additions and subdivided things up. And for us, we're really working in this kind of context and actually learning from a very similar approach. So I think the idea of building a new space inside an old space is quite normal in this area, but I think for architects to propose this to cities is not something that is so common. And also the way that we did it was to do it with these prefabricated panels that we ended up developing. So these are some before and after images. You see that all of the original building is still there, and then our building is just right inside. It's very difficult when you try to match the glass and you try to match the aesthetic, because you know, you can't get the kind of insulation and quality from these older approaches unless if you spend a lot of money, right? And in these areas, these are low-income communities. You just don't, you actually have very little funding available. And this neighborhood, this area here, you can see how many units. Actually, these courtyard houses have all been subdivided up, actually. And so where one courtyard was for one family originally, now it's for many families. So they've been subdivided up, and some now are still occupied, while many are actually unoccupied. So you see all the red ones, all the dark red ones are ones that are vacant. So this neighborhood is a very, you know, it's a great location. It's right in the center of the city, but the conditions are poor, and much of it is empty. So it doesn't really make much sense, right? You would think that it wouldn't be so difficult to turn this into a quite attractive place to live. So that's what we did. We turned this into a system. So these panels allowed us to bring them through these narrow alleyways into the buildings, and then build a structure inside the original structure. And we did these for local residents, and it could be done in an affordable way. And it can also be done very quickly. So it's also really important that we could do this in a short amount of time, because a lot of residents are reluctant to participate in any kind of program because they're afraid that they might not be able to come back. You know, and that's happened before, where the government will have a program to renovate, and then residents actually just lose their homes. Because a lot of the people who live here are also they also live within a kind of a their status is unclear. You know, not all of them are entirely legal in terms of how in terms of the positions here. So it's a very sensitive situation, and so for us, the idea was to create this intervention to ease a lot of these issues and allow this place to really improve. And so these are all plans and sections of all the different types of plugins that we've done. And this is meant to show how adaptive the system can be. While all these structures are going to be a little bit different, right? And old structures are never straight. With our system, we're able to adapt to all these different conditions. So again, being able to deal with a situation that is unexpected, you can't predict. And so this is the first resident, Mrs. Dong, who agreed to use our system. And so you can see here, this is all the stuff that she owns. So she, in one day, she moved this out, we installed the unit, and then the next day she was able to move the stuff back in and live in a new place. So this is something that can really happen in one day. But of course, these spaces are also very small. You know, this is around 20 square meters. This is how her house was originally, and this is how it is now. This is a view of our office. So we use the same system for our office. We built these large doors that can open up so that you can really connect with the courtyard more easily. And aside from this area in Beijing, we started doing other locations. So this one is a location in the far south of China, in Shenzhen. And it's kind of a similar situation, except these houses are even worse off. I mean, they don't even have roofs a lot of the times. And the legal situation here is also a little bit different. For certain, there's this kind of strange situation where the government can't take over these units because the ownership is still unclear. So they're kind of left there, and they're left sitting there. No one can really do anything with them. You can't touch them. So our proposal was to upgrade them without touching the original, and still, again, you can use these buildings while the status of ownership is still unclear. And so this is one of the buildings. You can see that process is quite rapid, and and doesn't have to affect the things around us. Here again, there's barely a building left, but you're not there. They weren't able to redevelop this area, so yeah, we would propose to use a plugin for this. Yeah, you can see the different you can see all the different types of housing, different situations, right? The density. You have a lot of informality happening here. You see over here with the blue roofs, people building on top and building additions. And then you have these areas, these large areas are just kind of left untouched because it just hasn't been resolved, the property rights. I show this also to show that we get really involved with everything, you know. So it's not just designing the housing. We as you saw, we also install them. We deal with the manufacturing production, but we also have integrated septic systems into these projects, because in these areas you actually don't have a sewage system. That's part of the reason why you know, there's a lot of vacancy. So what we did is in the courtyard, sometimes we'll install septic tanks that connect to several units, or we'll have composting toilets, such as this one, that are really as advanced as we could find. This one's a Canadian product, and we integrate this into our structure. So it allows people to have, you know, to have the convenience of being able to use the bathroom in their own home instead of having to go outside to a public toilet, which is what most people have to do. This is Mrs. Fan, another resident that we built a plugin for, but she was the first resident that asked us to build a plugin house that was outside of an existing structure. So the earlier projects we did together with the local government, but then residents started coming to us individually, asking us to work on their own properties, on their own projects. So Mrs. Fan was one of these people. And I can show a video of Mrs. Fan here.
我从小在这个院子长大的，从小学1年级开始吧，一直到高中，一直生活在这个大杂院里面，对这个院子有很多特别美好的回忆。高2的时候吧，我父母在辅石路那边又买了一套楼房。我不太喜欢住楼房，首先那一道门就感觉把你们两家就给隔阂出来了。但是这个平房吧就不一样，那么窄的一胡同，每天大家都是抬头不见低头见的，点一下头哈个腰微笑一下，很小的动作大家就心领神会了。妈妈不太想让我再回这边来住，他们觉得你们俩都成家了啊，也应该自己买一套房子。但是我是觉得我有这么一套房子是我自己的，我完完全全可以重新打造一下，变成一个我自己喜欢的小屋。周围的邻居也过来参观，盖的过程中大家都可能会比较好奇吧，因为之前都是那种砌砖式的，像这个是那种内合板，它是一个整体搭建过来的。盖完了以后，他们会觉得你这小房子弄得挺新颖的，很不错。如果设计成这样，没有人不愿意回来吧。我跟我母亲多少都会有叫什么密闭忧郁症啊，就是我们不能在一个特别封闭的空间里待着。之前的房子非常的暗，那个时候进到这个屋子，你几乎分不清楚是白天还是晚上，没有采光。现在就是完全不一样，敞亮度、明亮度各个方面就会觉得很舒服。我很喜欢阳光普照在身上的那种感觉，就会很温暖。觉得堆肥马桶呢，既解决了让自己在屋里可以方便，又不会破坏环境，所以我觉得国外做的非常好，应该在国内进行推广。空间有限嘛，有一个小的露台，夏天你可以晒晒被子，可以布置成一小花园，头顶就是蓝天，环境又好又惬意。现在写字楼啊都是在城里嘛，买一套房子不是说挺贵，真的很贵。改造这个平房，总的来说它是比买房子要压力小很多很多。 之前每天工作往返都要4个小时，但是现在往返的路程就1个小时，这样我每天可以节省很多时间，不用花在路上。我可能比人早走一步，更快的接受了一下这种新鲜的事物。但是我觉得，就是因为会有人首先接受新事物，大家应该都会更向往这种生活，也希望自己的居住条件变得更好。
Yeah, so this process involved Mrs. Fan's input from the beginning. So we worked very closely with her and also with any of the residents that we do this with. Interestingly, the building, the shape of the building really came about from not from any kind of regulation or guidelines from the city, because in fact this is an informal structure. It's not exactly legal. There's no permitting process, right? So again, this a world of uncertainty. Although this is something that people do all the time, and there was an existing structure built here that was informal, so it was really replacing that existing structure. But what we had to deal with was the neighbors, and so that's what defined the shape of this. Mrs. Fan, she had to work out with all her neighbors, what we had to be aware of, and so with a neighbor's ventilation or sunlight and view and whatnot, that's how we sort of carved up the shape of this house. In fact, one thing that happened was when we first built this, it looked like this, and then one of the neighbors came out and complained. She was like, "Hey, you're blocking my view," and we said, "Well, didn't you work this out with all your neighbors? That's what we agreed on." And she said, "Actually, I haven't spoken to that neighbor for over a decade." So you have these kind of these kind of disputes between neighbors that result in an issue like this. And so actually, this got her to sit down with her neighbor and kind of discuss things, and our solution was to say, okay, well, why don't we also just cut off this corner right here to then ensure that it doesn't block your neighbor's sunlight. So you see this corner was basically just chopped off. And this also shows the flexibility of our system, is that even though it's all prefabricated, and you actually have these locks that are integrated into these insulated panels to connect everything together, we can also do some things on site and to change things. So this is also quite common, that we're changing the designs all the way up until after the building is built. And so yeah, this is the final result. But I think it's also important to show how our interventions are done in a way where it's really, we think of it as being a part of the aggregation of all of the activities and the history and the traces of all the things that have happened in these areas, including with the earlier ones where we're building a building inside. What we're able to do is to keep a lot of what exists, what's currently there and what was there from before. And we believe that this is really crucial to be able to do things this way. The alternative is to rebuild this all over again. And while you could build it in a way where it looks maybe like a style from a certain period, you've really erased all the traces of anything that's happened. So we've actually learned a lot from understanding these places based on what we see, like how people add tarps and brick on top for waterproofing. They recycle windows from other projects to build these extensions. And you also see that there's other ways of using prefabricated panels to build structures as extensions of their houses. So what we have here is actually not incongruent with what's happening in this space. Actually, what you see is you almost don't see any original structure here, right? And there's not a structure from one particular period. They're all from different periods. Yes, so yeah, we definitely see this as a part of how things work in this area. The next section, I'll bring this to a different context, I guess. I think looking at this, at these plugins from a greater distance, I think part of what we're addressing is also the disparity between different places in cities, right? You see, this is a city in South called Guangzhou, and you'll see it's a very stark difference, right, between some of these areas and the surroundings. And this is also a stark economic difference. And we think of this as actually being quite damaging for a city to have such a disconnect between places. In the U.S., we have very much the same thing. Through 2020, we've been dealing with all kinds of sort of deep-rooted social issues, economic disparity. Here I show some maps of Chicago where lower economic communities are clearly geographically delineated, right? I mean, cities are very, very clearly carved up for different kinds of people, different types of housing, different level standards of living. And Chicago is just one of these examples. I mean, every American city, every large American city definitely has this problem, and it's done in a very similar way. In this case, carved up by infrastructure. So we also started looking at the U.S. as a place for using our plugin houses. There's a policy in the U.S. that is becoming more and more popular, and it's concerned with what we call accessory dwelling units. And so the idea is to allow people, to encourage people to build houses inside their backyards. So on private property, in your yard space, wherever it is, as long as it satisfies certain requirements, it can't be too large, it has to have setbacks. But the idea is to have private citizens build additional housing to increase the area, the built area on their site. And it's another way of providing more housing to people. And because the housing is smaller, typically it would be lower cost in terms of using it as a rental property. So these units, a lot of cities don't allow them to be sold, but you can rent them out. So it would be lower cost rental property, right? So this is something that is still experimental in many places, but it's also been very much embraced, not just in the US, but other places in the world. I think in the UK and Canada, they're doing things like this, and possibly other places. But it's especially important for places where there's very low density or semi-low density, right? So in the US, even when you're in places that are very close to city centers, you still have a lot of low density housing with very large backyards. And this is actually a kind of a discriminatory process. Discriminatory kind of way of ensuring that you don't allow for more people to move into these places, right? Because they actually have requirements as to how much space you have around you and how large your building is. And so this hopefully can affect that a little bit. And for us, we also used our approach to help promote this this kind of policy. So this is similar to some of those installations that we've done before. So we took the plug-in house and we installed it in different places, held exhibitions and events to kind of broadcast this this idea of accessory dwelling units. So this is at Harvard University, at Harvard Yard, right in the center of campus. I was there as a Loeb fellow a few years ago. So I was there for a year, and this was a part of what I was doing, is to share this project with people here. And so we had students come, and these students weren't necessarily architecture students, but they were students from different places, and most have never built anything before. So we also showed that people without any kind of previous experience can build a house. And we did this in a day. And quickly we had a space where we can hold lectures, and we had all kinds of information inside about this kind of housing, and yeah, just had people from different places make use of the space. So it was also really a nice opportunity to activate this area on campus, and in this case, you can see a lot of families were able to come here and hang out. We also worked closely with the city of Boston. We worked with the mayor's Housing Innovation Lab, and their work is to innovate with housing policy. And so we worked together with them to support what they were trying to do with policy, with an actual example that people can come and experience and touch and feel and understand. Right, so because a lot of times policy, they're trying to push out policy, but it's only done with words, right? Here, we're able to provide an example of an actual building, and this is right next to Boston City Hall. That's the building up here behind us. And so the city actually held discussions inside our plug-in house, talking about these kinds of housing. So, we weren't necessarily saying that you could only use our house to do this kind of housing. I mean, it could be any kind of approach, but it was really of our interest to encourage people to get interested in this policy. And we collected input. People gave feedback on the policy, but also on our plug-in house, and it was very informative, very educational. It was quite a nice experience. And these are different pictures of that. This last part of my talk will relate more to education, but still using a similar approach as what you just saw with engaging with communities, building things at full scale that people can experience. And so we've been designing also a lot of schools these last few years. And we found that while we're designing these schools, we realized that a lot of these ideas, while as architects we feel very strongly about in terms of how space can affect education and so on and so forth, but we don't really have great proof or firsthand experience with really how this might work. Right. So what we decided to do is to build some of these structures, these wood structures, that we could then attach different things to, or it could be something that you can attach things that we didn't expect, right? That teachers and students would come up with, and so we came up with this kind of structure, this design. And installed them in lots of different schools, and then worked with teachers and students to explore the possibilities of space affecting learning, affecting education, right? And for us, it was an opportunity to observe how people how students and teachers use space for education. So this is a preschool this was done in Boston. I worked with the teachers here and the principal, and a researcher as well, who focuses on early age education. And this has also been very much influenced by a lot of ideas from Italy, the Montessori schools, Reggio Emilia Malaguzzi's ideas on space being the third teacher. So these ideas are highly influential in how we conceive of our projects, and also how these schools run their programs. And it's another opportunity for us to try to bring architecture and learning closer together. So these are just some snapshots of videos that we took. We were documenting how kids were using these spaces. This is an example of role play, right? Just having a space of their scale, and also kind of delineating a sort of a stage type of area. Encourages that. And we also did this in schools in China. This is a school in a rural area, again, lower income families. And these places, it's especially difficult to get good quality education, you can imagine, right? And especially in China, a lot of it's kind of, not very exploratory, really focused on memorization and things like that. And some of these ideas that we have in Europe and the US are very new in China, although there's a lot of interest in it. I mean, with an economy that is so focused on innovation, you really need the next generation to know how to have experience with thinking creatively, right? And that's not how the education system is structured in China. So it's very testing focused. So I think there's a lot of interest in this. We've also installed this in other locations. This is in a design museum, and is part of a larger exhibition on education. But for the exhibition, we left this open, and it wasn't lined off. People can come in and use it and change it and try things out. This is another situation where we use this again in exhibition, but one that's very interactive. Oh, this is just something I wanted to show from my own personal experience during COVID. These are my kids, and when COVID started, I thought, well, maybe I'll also build one of these little lofts in our house, just to help with managing them and also having a space that is to their scale, that was adaptable. So the experience also helped me with kind of dealing with this COVID situation. And another thing that's interesting during COVID was that this project was very widely talked about. I don't know if you remember, but in Wuhan, where COVID started, they made a big deal about this hospital that was built in, I don't know, it's like 10 days or something like that. Modular prefab construction. And it actually turns out that we were using the exact system, working with this that same manufacturer to build schools. And so this was actually built also during COVID. I mean, it was planned earlier, but it's built around the same time. And it's the same system. It can be flat packed, so these are not shipping containers. They can actually be shipped flat and then erected on site, incorporating a lot of the waterproofing and the wiring and things into it. And this was a pop-up school for the city of Shenzhen again. And then later last year, we built another school using the system. This is much larger. And you can see it's built on a very tight site that was not meant for a school. But Shenzhen, this city that is growing, extremely fast. One of the fastest growing cities anywhere, and it's part of one of the largest megalopolises in the world. Megalopolis meaning it's a conglomeration of many very large cities that have become, they've expanded to the point where it's almost kind of one large, huge city. And in order to accept such a large increase in population, you also need a whole lot of schools, right? Where you have all this housing coming up. So this is a part of that process. It's extremely important that these schools go up very quickly, and this was really done in a couple months from the very beginning all the way through construction was very quick. It was about a week or so, but including the manufacturing and the shipping, and also a lot of the site work. The school was able to open quite quickly. Yeah. So these are some pictures. We still haven't had a chance to take nice pictures of the project yet. And also try to create a good amount of flexibility between all the different spaces in the school with the courtyards and such. And this is the last project I'll show. It's of another school, a larger scale, but it's just an example of how we've incorporated a lot of these ideas that we've learned from our lofts into our architectural, the more permanent buildings. And I think for us, it's a really nice way of working where you're not speculating as much. We can really talk about some of these ideas of how you break down boundaries and use space, encourage experiential ways of learning through actual experience on our part in terms of working with teachers and students. So this is a project also in Shenzhen, actually. It's a large public school, primary and secondary school. And this was a part of a competition that we won. We're very, very happy about that. And yeah, this will be going into construction in about a year. So that's my talk. Happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shen. I think that the examples you brought to us today are quite impressive, especially for the flexibility and the adaptability aspects, and also about how you made people interact in your sites, because even if the approach was different, starting from the plug-in houses to the not permanent installations or those schools you just show us, all of them are concentrated in the interactions. I'm seeing that are concentrated on the interactions that people are there between the people that live there. I have a questions slash considerations about the first aspect you talked about the plug-in houses, because it was the first project that really impressed me when I started to approach to your studio. And I think that, do you think that considering like the immigration from the countryside to the main cities in China is one of the biggest issues of urban system in China, do you think that the plug-in houses can be a way to avoid also the big master plans and also all the old point of view in architecture that you have to build new buildings and then change everything? That sometimes also the risk is to create another gentrification system to create other gentrified places in our historic centers or in our centers, city centers. And I don't know, because I'm curious about it, because I think that it can be a solution and can be the best way also to try to maintain our lifestyle and the living pattern that are in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, so migration from the countryside to the cities is incredible in China. I mean, it's really what fueled the economy for the last few decades. I think it's slowed a little bit, but yeah, I mean, the cities are still growing at a very, very fast pace, especially compared to other cities outside of China. so yeah, housing is a very crucial issue. Just like it is in most countries, actually. I mean, even without the rural urban migration, our housing is really a deep housing crisis. The U.S. talks about housing as if it's just a U.S. issue, but I mean, in so many countries I visit, people talk about the same things. So even without that migration, it's a deep problem. In Shenzhen, though, well, so I talk about. I guess I could talk a little bit more about Shenzhen because Shenzhen's a little bit unique. It's as a city it's really a city of migrants. The city didn't really exist until they opened the economy. Different from Beijing, right? Beijing, you have all these already areas that are very much developed. So Shenzhen is even more so a place of change. And a lot of our projects happen in Shenzhen, I think, because they're a little bit more open about how you deal with change, right? Being able to do a project in Beijing is very difficult. Things are kind of, maybe it's a little bit like, maybe I guess it'd be a little bit like an old city like Rome, right? Or Florence, where you're trying to do a new project. Shenzhen is like an LA, like you're kind of starting from anew in many ways. So you can be a little bit more experimental there. So that's why I think our plugins, we started in Beijing, but then we started, doing more of them in other locations. And now we have them in cities other than just Beijing and Shenzhen. But as an actual housing solution, I'm not sure if the plugin can achieve that as it is right now. So housing in China and also in Shenzhen, it's so dense that you really have to go vertical. So I think there would have to be a solution that is multi-story. Maybe not really tall towers. Maybe there's a way to have kind of medium-sized towers that are closely packed. But these are very difficult issues too, because there's a lot of housing policy that really prevents you from being very flexible with how you can pack things in. So these things are being experimented with. Although I think the way that we approach things with the plugin house could be very useful. So that is to not have to rebuild things from scratch, right? I think there could still be ways of building high density housing in existing communities without creating such large disruptions, without having to relocate people, without having to tear everything down. Maybe you can do it in a partial way, or maybe you can upgrade in a way where you don't have to do that. And like I think currently the L'Occitane Vassal work with their winning the Pritzker, I think also highlights a lot of these approaches, right? So I think that's a very positive thing. For us, we are working on multi-level plugin houses. I think you can also, there's lots of different systems that are appropriate for different uses. So I think for us right now, the US is probably a more fitting context because it is much lower density, a lot of single family housing that is single story or double story, a lot of wasted space. So for the plugin house, I think here, that's where we're focusing on. In China, we're using in a lot of historic areas where you really can't do that kind of building. But for the large part, most of the housing is gonna have to be higher density, multi-story housing.
Okay, thank you. I asked this because I added the gentrification phenomena, because when I started to study how people approach when you have to redevelop a neighborhood, a whole neighborhood, I saw that the approach is usually to to add new functions, to renovate and retrofit the whole buildings, and bring old and make them like old bars, cool restaurants, and famous brands, and like I don't know, some shikumen projects to renovate some Shikumen neighborhoods in Shanghai or the Yutong in Beijing. But the difference is that when I saw like some neighborhoods completely renovated, they, in my opinion, it's just an opinion, they lost the atmosphere of the neighborhood. Instead, when I saw your examples, actually, I think that people that still live there, the atmosphere is the same. It's just more livable. That's why those cases impressed me, because I think that you really achieved the goal to avoid the gentrification.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're trying. I mean, gentrification is definitely really on the top of our minds when we're doing this work. And you know, it's one of these things that's just such a difficult issue to tackle, because it extends much further than just the architecture, right? And so I think that's why we try very hard to work with policymakers, right? So the plug-in house was supported by a change in local policy, and this was experimental policy in this area in Beijing that was then kind of expanded to the rest of the country. You know, so I think to find those instances where you have some flexibility in terms of how you approach things from a policy level is really important in order to support different ways of upgrading areas, revitalizing areas, and you have to do it in a very sensitive way. So, yeah, I mean, our approach really was not so much about preserving a building; it was really more about preserving, as you said, the kind of the life that's happening in this area, and also ensure that the people that, you know, the range of socioeconomic communities that are living there can stay there, right? I mean, you can add people, but can you add people without pushing people out, right? And I think that's possible. Such as the example in the U.S. is really an example of that, right? To be able to add people, you actually have to add housing, and you have to add density, and you have to add a certain type of housing. It can't be just expensive housing. So you need to have that kind of diversity. And I think a lot of housing ends up being really expensive, or a lot of developments end up being really expensive because they spend a lot of money to move people out and to redo the infrastructure, all that sort of thing. So for us, it's really a kind of a light approach, right? That you're not investing very much at all in the redevelopment costs, right? You're really investing a lot of energy into working with the community and in discussions and coming up with alternatives. And it's done in a sort of incremental way, right? It's not done all at once. So luckily, we've had a chance to do this work in places where you just don't have the opportunity to do it all at once. Like they're forced to come up with alternatives. But hopefully, we'll find more and more situations where they choose to do things sort of incrementally, right? Pockets at a time, that are just more economical. And I think there is now more recognition that the existing life that you have in cities is just way more valuable than what you could do by redeveloping the area. And I already gave you an example of that in Beijing, that the site next to us. That's why we had this opportunity. But yeah, I think in the areas like you mentioned in Shanghai, you do have a lot of these projects that are really new developments. They're like shopping malls that look like old buildings. And I think now enough time has gone by that people recognize that you know, that doesn't add as much as you can potentially to these areas. And what happens, a lot of people, when they may be relocated and they have new housing sort of further away in cities, but they'll still go back to these older areas to spend their time. You know, it's kind of interesting. So they, you know, their lives are already around these kind of newer areas, but their connections and their identity are tied to these places that are more older and more run down. So I like the example of Mrs. Fan for our plug-in house, because she's a younger generation. She grew up, she was born in that neighborhood. Their whole family left. they ended up living in a high-rise apartment, and but Mrs. Fan, expecting a child, just having gotten married, she wanted to move back to this neighborhood, right? She missed that connection, and she talked a little bit about this kind of this community life, the ties to the people around her, that was very valuable, and also it was just much closer to work and a lot more convenient.
Yes, I think that this last aspect and also the Miss Pen examples is quite interesting, and also should make us think about the livability and the interactions between the neighbors in our tower of housing. Okay, so anyone has some questions here on Zoom?
Yep. I have 2 questions plus a question from the live stream. So first question, I'm going question by question. I think is more easy. So first question, some month ago here in Milan, looking at a building surrounded by scaffoldings because of some facade renovations. I enjoyed the movement of some textile panels attached to the scaffoldings as a cover, because the wind was blowing and the result was a wind reactive facade. So I asked myself, what if scaffoldings were actually part of the building? And so my question is related to the relationship between permanent and temporary structures. So what's this relationship? How we should connect these almost opposite concepts, and how to approach them not as isolate solutions. So permanent with its aims and rules, and temporary with its, let's say, even technical details and materials, but as an interconnected solution.
Yes, I think so the subject of temporary versus permanent is really interesting, because a lot of people assume that when you are temporary, that it's a lower building quality, right? And oftentimes that could be the case. Usually that's probably the case, but today that's not necessarily so. So, we saw that hospital in Wuhan that was built quickly, that's a permanent building. But, actually people may not, this is probably not something that a lot of people know, but the regulations surrounding that system, that type of building system is not, prevents you from really using that as a permanent building. So it's, there are regulatory issues about this, where the structure, it can meet every single standard of a permanent building, but just because of its nature, policy hasn't adapted itself to accepting this as a valid building approach, right? So I think this idea is still new, to think that a building can be built quickly, but not just that you can also take it apart if you need to, right? Like that hospital, say there's a whole wing that is insufficient, right? You need to build a taller part. You can actually take that apart and take that away and add another one in, or extend on it. That's actually now today much more possible than before. It would have been really difficult to do that before. So I think that's part of the issue, is to understand, to not think of buildings actually as temporary, not to call them as temporary, but to call them as flexible, or to have some other kind of terminology, right? So a lot of the building, like the plugins that we built, those plugins are of a much higher quality than most permanent buildings, especially from an energy standpoint, from a sustainability standpoint, because the kind of insulation and the materials that we're using is just way higher. And partially that's because it's being manufactured in a factory, right? So another part of this conversation is also being built on site or off site, prefabricated and modular. And I think if we think about this in terms of our products, the things that are around us, our cell phones or cars or the furniture that we use, none of that stuff is built by hand or on site, right? Like architecture is one of the last industries that relies on this. And because of that, you can't reach certain levels of quality very easily. Or if you do, it's very expensive, right? So I think that's another part of this discussion. But yeah, people aren't quite used to that yet. And the plugins, another thing is it's also a social issue, because for those residents to be able to have a plugin house that you can then, if one day you were forced to have to relocate, you can actually take your house with you. You know, you can pack that down and ship it to another place and rebuild it. You know, there's the life of that building is beyond its place on that site. Whereas even when you don't own the property, if you own the house on top of the property, you don't think that house is something that you can keep, right? Like if you had to leave, if you have to sell that property, that house goes with it. So yeah, I think these are all concepts that are newer and will take some time for people to kind of understand and explore its potential.
Yeah, I would use adaptive architecture rather than flexible, maybe. And talking about terminology, my second question is how you translate the word plugin in Chinese. What does it mean from a semantic point of view? Because it should have a deep meaning to be accepted by the social and cultural, let's say, consolidated environment. So I'm curious about it.
Actually, plugin in Chinese is also the same meaning. So, but the meaning in terms of like a plugin for a piece of software, right? So you have a piece of software, you have all these different plugins that you then attach to improve the software as things change. I think that's part of the meaning behind it. It might not be a meaning that the general public fully understands, but you know, that's where we came from, and that's the translation. But another thing about plugging in is, I think, right, like you're adding to something. I think you sort of naturally understand it as an addition, right? It's not necessarily an original, I guess. And it started off with the ones that were building inside the houses, inside the old houses. But then we started building ones that are outside, right? But then I think the meaning still worked because we're building inside an existing community. So we're plugging into a site that wasn't originally meant to hold more housing or another piece of property, even from a legal standpoint, right? And I think that is actually a very appropriate, probably a much more valid approach than what we normally see. And certainly there's also the history of AGORÄ and their plugin cities and things like that. It's just, you know, Metabolist, all that period of exploring these ideas. I think for us, we're really trying to take a lot of these ideas and further develop them, explore them, and use them, except in an existing context. You know, a lot of those ideas were sort of, you could imagine, like the environment was imaginary. You didn't really know how it existed in terms of its context. So for ours, the context is very, very important.
Okay, so third question is from Berk Otsturka, who is asking, how will you define the architect's identity nowadays and what could become in the future? Let's say an intro, because we are working as Agora magazine on identity. So the next issue is going to be on identity. So we are really interested on this topic. And so I would extend this question, adding another one. So how you deal with identity?
Well, that's a really great question. You know, I mean, it's a very deep issue when it comes to us, not just as architects, but as people in society, right? But I think maybe a short answer is that architects really, our identity, you know, I think fundamentally we are we are providing a larger vision, right, of our environment. I think our skills allow us to think of things in a more comprehensive, holistic way, right? And in terms of how we do that, I think we really need to change that. You know, in order for us to really ensure that we have a value in bringing these visions to reality, we need to have more. We need to put ourselves in positions where we have a lot more agency. You know, that we can really affect things more. So I think being a person to execute the very narrow vision of one particular private client or developer doesn't really allow us to do that. But you know, I think part of being holistic, working across disciplines and across, you know, levels of society, means that we are sort of a middleman, right? Like we are a connector between things. So I think if we put ourselves in that kind of position, then we can have more security in terms of our value, right? So you know, there's a lot of housing work that doesn't require much exploration or creativity, right? But we try to put ourselves in a position where that skill is really required. And also we try to deal with all aspects of this. So you saw with our plugins, we're dealing with we found a manufacturer, we developed this material. You know, we're dealing with the regulatory aspects of building code, right? It's not just planning and you know, permitting, but also with building code that relates to certain materials. So because the materials that we're using they're not standard materials. There's no code for these materials. So if you want to experiment with different building systems and different materials and composites, connections, you also have to deal with the policy, because there's a lot of responsibility when you're doing that kind of work, right? So it's also increasing your risk, increasing your responsibility. And then on the other side, then working with policymakers who are making those rules that define your buildings, right? And also working with communities that then put those policymakers in place, right? In the end, the people, the public, you know, they are the people that are affecting a lot of these rules. And so I think in order to connect all these, and also understanding that, yeah, not just the rules and the policies and all that stuff, but also understanding the economics behind things, right? To understand the financing of things and to be a part of that. So our plugin house right now is a separate company that is, it's actually formed in the US to then, it's a separate company in the business of making and selling houses. And we found the funding for that, found the partnerships, the US manufacturer, and then we now have permits to build these we're starting in Austin, Texas. But yeah, you know, I'm not your traditional architect. I have to deal with the business side of things, the manufacturing, the materials, the policy, all that stuff. So hopefully we can be a little bit more open-minded about how we work as architects. I don't think it's necessary to think of this field in such a traditional way. I mean, it's in reality, there's just not enough work for a very traditional architect.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Question about public space, because you showed us many examples of public space appropriation, free appropriation of a public space. And I was asking what's the relationship between the functionalization of this public space and the free appropriation, even if with a temporary structure. Thank you.
Well, the examples I showed were not exactly public space, probably mostly private property. You know, the concept of public space in China is not so widely accepted, I guess. Yeah, there's actually very little public space. So what happens is a lot of the life happens in streets, parking lots, those spaces where you don't have anything put permanent, right? And whatever's on top is sort of shifting and moving around. And so that's the arena where you can have, you know, where there's different ways of appropriation. Even the tricycles, you know, tricycles, people will live on tricycles, they'll have shops on tricycles, and that's basically, right, space that's moving around but contains functions that are often you know, permanently located on a site, right? So a lot of the times we're functioning within these areas. But also we found that unless if you provide an example of what could happen here, that it's very hard for people to imagine different uses of space, right? So I think in most of our projects, you know, they are examples of the potential of space being being used publicly. You know, I might not call it public, but you know, it's used by the public. And I think cities today are being so privatized that you actually, even public space is becoming more private, right? Or it's privately funded and so on and so forth. So I think our thinking about publicness also needs to change. We have to be more flexible. Unfortunately, most of the money I think now these days is coming from the private sector. But the private sector also has, you know, there's an advantage for the private sector to provide for private space, for public, you know, space that's open to the public, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of the arena that our project work within. So a lot of times we're not working with the city. Actually, we're working with our clients to do these things. Only our projects in Europe or other countries where we've really worked a lot with the city, with these projects, like in Boston, you know, we work with the city government and so on. But the university is also a private space, right? But that's a public, you know, it's open to the public, and it's almost never closed, this area in the university. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think we have to engage a little bit differently now with how we conceive of this kind of space. Some people call it third space, space that is in between private, public, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. It's all clear.
Okay, anyone else?
Yes, please. I have one for me. Do you hear me?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay, thank you, James, for your very interesting lecture. It was very inspiring. The concept of plugin, actually, the plugin structure is very inspiring. And because in my opinion, it changes the way space can be kind of inhabited, destroying some principles which are related to the traditional city. And I would like to push a little bit the plugin concept application to think with you a kind of extreme scenario. So do you think it's possible to go ahead and start imagining entire cities based on this construction technique? Like, I'm actually interested more on the social impact that this behavior can have on our communities. So in other words, do you think that entire plugin made long-term community could work from the social, politics, and commercial point of view? Thank you.
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, if I use the example of Italy, I mean, maybe you can tell me more about this, but when I visit places like Venice, right? Oftentimes for the Biennale, you know, that city is not a city that was built at once, right? It was built incrementally. You know, parts are jutting out and additions and things, you know, certainly don't always match and so on and so forth. I mean, that's actually how all cities have developed over time, right? I think the difference today is the way the economics works. It's, you know, it's beneficial to redevelop huge areas all at once, and beneficial to develop really far out, right? Because land is cheap, and to develop in low density because it's less expensive. And I think as we're confronted with climate change and our impact on the environment, we just can't continue like that. So really, I think in larger, denser cities, already you have to build in an incremental way. And I think we shouldn't think of cities as being frozen either, right? Like a lot of older cities that, you know, the efforts for preservation are done to such an extreme where it could be actually detrimental to the life of the city, right? To the extended life of the city. And it also prevents a lot of people from actually just being there. You know, it just makes it very expensive, right? So I think in terms of gentrification and land value, property value, all this kind of environment just exacerbates that, right? It makes these high value areas too expensive. Whereas a lot of cities previously, you could have high value areas where, you know, there's a lot of life, a lot of people, a lot of activity. People could still afford to live there. Yeah, we need to be able to do this in a healthy and denser, more balanced way. So I think the approach is absolutely valid because that's just how it's always been. I think the task is to come up with real ways of doing that, right? That work with the system to sort of steer it differently. So it's just not, if it's just more advantageous from a business point of view to develop far off and you know, then that's just going to happen. You know, it's naturally going to happen. But if it's more advantageous to do it incrementally and so on and so forth, we can kind of build up that system. Then I think the architecture will match that. Yeah, so I don't think of it as a new thing. I think it absolutely is very possible. It doesn't have to be a plugin. It could be lots of different approaches to building, but it needs to meet those needs.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so time runs, and thank you everyone, and thank you, Mr. Shen, to have been with us today.
Sure.
And everyone, don't miss our next lecture next Saturday. So thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.